And Jacob had a dream, and behold, in his dream a ladder stretched up from earth and reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were going up and down them. And I saw the Lord standing above it, and said, I am the Lord, the God of your grandfather Abraham, and the God of your father Isaac. The land whereon you lie, I will give it to you and your descendants. And your descendants shall become as the dust of the earth, and they will spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and through your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now, does that sound familiar? I'm Alan Anzik. Welcome to Coffee Table Discussions. This is my coffee table, this is my coffee, and coming up next is the discussion. In the last episode of this series, we looked at the promises God made to the fathers of Israel, and we found that the same promises were transmitted down the line of inheritance. That promise is the basis for everything which God has been doing and continues to do. And contrary to how many church institutions have made it appear over time, the promises have not changed. God maintains the same specific plan, and it's not a plan to run our life, but to save humanity from itself. The promise was to build a home for all humanity, a kingdom, with all the attributes of transparency and the freedom to exercise the gift of choice through understanding. Something which is in direct contrast to many of the governments outside the kingdom, and this is becoming more and more obvious as the world separates. This has been God's ongoing objective, or how else do we interpret the following? And in you and in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And the way this was to be achieved was by developing the descendants of Abraham to become that instrument, that kingdom, and that government. Your seed will be like the stars, if you can number them, or like the sand of the sea, a blessing to all the families of the earth. And then to Isaac, he showed that he would never, ever, ever give up on that promise, regardless of whatever Abraham's seed would do. It was demonstrated to Abraham how the promise God had made would not be allowed to die. He would sacrifice anything and everything to keep his offspring alive. Then to Jacob, he makes the same promises and delineates roles to his 12 sons, not as a change to the plan, but to give more detail of the same plan. And your seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and you will spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. Genesis. Now I say that Jesus Christ was made a servant of the circumcision, the Israelites, on behalf of God's truth, to confirm the promises made to the fathers. Paul. Paul was clearly stating that Jesus didn't come to change anything, but he came to confirm or reiterate what God had said to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's quite astonishing, really, because when Paul was active in the middle of the first century, the seed of Jacob wasn't like the dust of the earth in number. They weren't a great kingdom or a company of nations, or controlling the gates of their enemies, or dominant, or even in possession of their own land. And they certainly weren't ready or in any position to bless the whole earth. So why did Paul say that Jesus came to confirm those promises that were made thousands of years before him? Simply, and without the slightest bit of any physical evidence, he believed what Jesus said when he said, God does not lie. My Father will keep his promise, and I have come to finish my Father's work. And that work was to put the project back on its tracks. That's why Jesus said, not one jot nor tittle will pass from the law until it is all fulfilled. And the law of God isn't the list of rules and regulations. God's law is his word. What was promised to Abraham became his law, and that's something that confused the hell out of the Pharisees because they thought they were experts in the law. In fact, it confuses many Christians today. What a lot of people believe God's law is, Jesus seemed to have very little interest in. The early apostles, including Paul, had a hard time envisaging the details of how the kingdom would be rebuilt and what exactly it would be like, which may be the reason why he wrote that he was unable to see clearly. As he seems to confess in one of his letters, he writes, "At the moment we see through a glass darkly, but eventually face to face, but for now we only know in part. During Paul's time, the tribes of sons of Jacob were all lost and wandering, who knows where, and the small contingent left in Jerusalem and Judea were under occupation. And as history records, after Paul and the rest of the apostles, it was going to get even worse. It is little wonder that he had no idea, only clues as to what the shape of the kingdom would take, and the work of restoring the kingdom had hardly begun. Today, of course, we have 2,000 years of hindsight and the revealing of the parables and his revelation, which shows what God has always said, I will keep my word. He's fulfilled his promise to Jacob and the sons of Israel, and now we can see how he did it. So, with the arrival of Jacob, we get to the business end of the kingdom God elected to use as the instrument for his project. The 12 sons were going to generate the houses or nations of Israel, and this would be the formation of the kingdom of God. Let's have a closer look at the business corporation, Jacob and Sons. Here are the lads, and if you notice, all his sons are included, whereas for Abraham, only one son, Isaac, out of Abraham's 8 boys, is chosen. And with Isaac, only Jacob was chosen. Esau, Jacob's brother, was filtered out. When we get to Jacob, the filtering process ends and all his sons are given a job or a role to play in the construction of the promised kingdom. That's what prophecy is, God's planned project. Each of the 12 houses have a characteristic emblems and banners assigned to them, and some have an extra special role. You can see Joseph down there on the right with his 2 boys. He'll feature on his own in a coming episode. We won't go through all the sons and their corresponding banners and symbols, but just as an introduction, here's a few examples of the types of emblems they congregated under. Reuben, of course, is represented in Revelation 4 as one of the 4 living creatures. If you recall, Reuben was one of the 4 lead tribes, represented by the head of a man, naked in this particular case. Simon, a castle. Judah, a lion, another one of the 4 living creatures. Zebulon, a ship. Asher, a tree. An eagle, a wolf, a unicorn, and an ox. A bit like selecting your token in Monopoly, no one ever wants to be the thimble. For me, it was always the race car, battleship, or a tantrum. If the 12 sons of Jacob had any choice in this selection, which they probably didn't, it's obvious Asher had last pick. Sorry, there's only the tree. Anyone like to swap? If you recall, the children of Israel camped around the tabernacle in a similar arrangement to this. The tabernacle was the temple, the throne, and the heart of the kingdom in the desert, which they packed up and took with them for 40 years as they tramped around the wilderness. You can see the flags next to each house or tribe. And if you remember from the last episode on the Revelation series, chapter 4, the setup with the sons of Jacob as they camped in the desert was the model to represent the kingdom of God. The arrangement of the children of Israel after they were led across into the wilderness to be with their God would be the parable of Christ gathering the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as it reads in Revelation chapter 12, and to the woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her own place, where she is nourished for a time, and half a times, 1,260 years. And that wilderness where she was to be restored and rebuilt was, of course, the British Isles. Before the children of Israel crossed the Red Sea and entered the desert wilderness and then their new homeland, they had spent 430 years in Egypt. The precise length of time is disputed quite significantly, actually. It could have been only 215 years, but for this discussion, let's just say they were there for a long time. Long enough so that Jacob and his 12 sons and their families who originally migrated into Egypt had well and truly died of old age, if nothing else. Over the centuries, the Israelites became second-class citizens and by any practical definition, slaves. But apparently they did quite well and ended up numbering about 600,000. They also managed to maintain their original family tribal ties. So they all knew which sons of Jacob they belonged to. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob, but that won't be your name any longer. From now on, your name shall be called Israel." And God said to him, "I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. You will be a nation, and a company of nations shall you be, and kings shall descend from you." Genesis. Well, he certainly became a company of nations through his sons. The Union Jack, the Union of Jacob, and the Federation of Nations which formed it is a lovely piece of representation. And of course, the Commonwealth which is still alive and well today. But why the name change? From now on, your name is going to be called Israel. In reality, the name Jacob was and still is used to identify the houses of Israel. What God was giving Jacob with the new name was a title or a description of what the relationship with God's project would be. The name Israel means to rule as God or with God. God was going to partner with Jacob's offspring to form the kingdom that would be used to bring light and blessing and salvation to all the families of the earth. Judah. The scepter, that is, the kingship, will never depart from Judah, nor a ruler's staff from between the feet until the one comes who owns them both, and to him will belong the allegiance of the nations. And there's a picture of a scepter. Both former and current monarchs are holding it in their right hand. It's the symbolic representation of kingship, and today, of course, there's no real power in those titles. It is an interesting relationship, however, and it goes back to the kings of Judah, which really only seems to survive today due to its symbolism. And to quite a few people, the symbol is one sense, is the stirring connection to what God said to Jacob and to Judah more than 3,000 years ago. It's one small physical artifact which attests to God keeping his word, regardless of the individual behaviour of any of the descendants from the line of Judah, from King David to the current King of England. To be perfectly honest, just looking at this artifact and without making any sort of value judgment, comparing the new lad with his mother, all that stuff on him looks a bit thrown on, really, without fitting too well, but I'm sure he'll grow into them. Yes, in comparison, she was definitely a form-fitting monarch. Now, King David was the first king from the line of Judah, and in a later episode, we'll look more closely at the significance of what was promised to him and his offspring. In brief, through David, God would set up a royal house based on Christ. In fact, that's one of his titles. Jesus is called the Son of David. One of the other more notable tribes was the tribe of Levi. There he is, Levi. The priests, the Levites, all the tribe of Levi, will have no part or inheritance with Israel. The Lord shall be their inheritance. Deuteronomy. This didn't mean the tribe of Levi were excluded from the other tribes, just that they wouldn't have their own slice of land. The Levites, from whom the priesthood came, were integral to the nation. In this picture, you can see all of the tribes gathered together in their positions with their banners. But where are the Levites? They're the ones looking after the central construction. The tabernacle temple was their workplace. And that's them running around inside the courtyard of the tabernacle, where they had a place for offering sacrifices and do ritualistic washing before approaching the entrance of the tent, which was the temple itself, and do some more priestly things. And then, at the back, was the Holy of Holies, where only the top priest was allowed to do the things only the high priest was allowed to do. The whole construction was designed for mobility and efficient packing up and unpacking as they moved around the desert. But after 40 years of roaming the desert, they finally crossed the Jordan River and into the promised land of Canaan. You can see all the tribal names on parcelled out portions of land, but you won't see an allotment for the Levites. But don't be sad, they wouldn't need any land because they would be looked after by a tithe, which was a form of taxation on all the tribes to meet all the needs of the Levitical priesthood. The Levites were like a civil service. They did more than just pray. They were a resource and served as teachers and judges. And when they moved into the land of Israel, they maintained the various cities of refuge. The Levites did have a geographical focal point when they were headquartered in Jerusalem, and that made sense because that was where the temple was finally located, and it was also the centre of kingship and the capital city for the nations of Israel. That's Jerusalem right there in the middle, And later on, of course, Israel divided itself into northern and southern states. And then a couple of centuries later, were ruthlessly pulled apart by the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, until all that was left by the time Jesus arrived was Jerusalem with its surrounding hinterland. But it explains why at the time of Jesus the kingdom consisted mainly of a dysfunctional temple in Jerusalem, the Levites, and the remnants of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. That small conglomeration is what became known as Jewish, and the particular religion they fashioned was called Judaism. It's a mistake to call all the tribes of Israel Jewish. The term should only really apply to those returning from Babylon in the 6th century BC who resettled in the land of Israel and were then in subjection to the Persians, Greeks and Romans. Abraham was not Jewish and neither was Isaac and Jacob. The distinction can best be understood with an example. Queensland is one of 6 Australian states. Now, if the other 5 states, Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania, Western Australia and South Australia, were to disappear, besides the celebrations that would go on all over Queensland, in time, being a Queenslander would seem exactly the same thing as being an Australian. If then the other states began to reappear, it would take some readjusting. Queensland would be just another state again, and being Australian would no longer be synonymous with being a Queenslander. And here's the problem with calling all of Israel Jews. It was a convenient term to use for a while for the last 2,500 years, while the houses of Israel were lost and wandering and unidentified. But now that they are coming back into view and identified in the parables, revelations, and in history, the term is inadequate and is even confusing. All the sons of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel, the whole house of Israel, have been labelled with emblems, banners and prophecy, so that the mystery of God, which is the question, what the heck happened to the kingdom promised the fathers of Israel, can be revealed when their restoration was complete and his parable understood. This was a brief introduction into the business end of God's project, Jacob and Sons. With the promises made to Jacob Israel, prophecy would now have its vehicle. We know the spoiler alert. Vehicle derails, falls to bits, and then Jesus comes, finds the bits, restores, rebuilds, and then puts the vehicle back on track. In the discussions to come, we will get into more detail about what happened to the bits and why the role of the Levitical priesthood was taken away when Jesus came to Jerusalem 2,000 years ago and offered that particular job to volunteers. But for this episode, let's appreciate the fact that God chose, elected and labelled the descendants of Jacob not for the purpose of picking out a master race, but so his work would be identified. This project is for the benefit of all humanity. That's what he told Abraham. Next week, we will look at the one major objection to the idea of God selecting the seed of Abraham and bringing the lost tribes to the shores of Britain. There is a legitimate concern with racism, but is this a racist concept? Let's find out in the next episode of this series, God's Burden. Jesus said, "Where 2 or more are gathered in my name, there will I be also." So let's take advantage of this offer and join in again next week for another coffee table discussion.